Hello, it's the Great Canadian Bagel here, coming to you with the first in the Ontario 2022 provincial election forecast series. So just right off the bat, before I start getting anything into the current status quo in Ontario, at the start roughly of when campaigning is going to start doing, I expect that to be really picking up in April. Like the pre-campaigning polling and news and stuff, but just a heads up. My intention is to make a video with this series like the ongoing current French one and the previous Canada one, roughly weekly, with the exception if the polls allow it. I think there are going to be enough polls for this to be able to fit this kind of schedule. If there's not, there might be larger gaps. For example, the Canadian series right now, my goal is weekly, but there's just not enough polls, so it would just be speculation if I just published a weekly video on it. We'll see how fast or if that can be held true. I think there will be enough polling for it. This is not Tuesday, the day this is being uploaded. Is likely not going to be the day that this is coming out going forward. It's just being bumped back a bit for the French election, and I'm right now, which is taking the Sunday slot, so this is going to be a different time slot in the week. We'll see how this goes forward. Otherwise, let us get into this. So, at the start of this, Doug Ford right now is absolutely dominating the seat projections. He's doing only mediocre in popular vote terms. And the reason he's managing to pull off this dominating position is entirely that the Ontario Liberal Party and the New Democratic Party of Ontario are perfectly vote splitting right now. They're both hovering around 25%, which means they're both doing equally bad. So, and on top of that, in places like Toronto, like the 416 in Toronto area, it's primarily the Liberals versus the NDP. With places like York Centre here, Doug Ford is leading, but he only has in the margin of, I believe, 35% right now. And a couple of these ridings, like in Brampton, Etobicoke, and a couple other places in the 416-905, he's only barely leading because the NDP and the Liberals are completely splitting their vote. It is quite an interesting position here. Oh, the other thing worth noting here, I have 4 parties listed. I am tracking the New Blue Party and the Ontario Party, or the Ontario First Party, can't remember its exact name. They are currently not going to be up on the splash or on the result maps unless they have a seat somewhere or they are in threatening enough range to take a seat. In this case, currently they're not either of those parties, with the strong caveat, since they have no previous election performance, it'll be difficult to gauge. Well, technically I believe the Ontario Party has previous election experience, but it was a relevant tiny party before. Now it's seeming like it might be something. But since they have very little specific local riding results, it's going to be difficult to really forecast them. So if they do turn out to be significant this election, I think that would be a major cause of error. And I'm just foreloading that, so that if that does happen, and let's say the New Blue Party ends up getting 40% of the vote and my maps are really wonky, that's going to be why. I don't think that's going to happen, but it is possible. So I just want to... You got to get your excuses out first for things that might make you screw up before you blame them. Because if I got it wrong and then I was there's these new parties, it's like, well, why didn't you figure it out? It's like, well, I'm telling right now, it doesn't look like... It's not reasonably plausible or possible that I could factor that in. New parties are always quite difficult in my model. When you're talking about forecasting them geographically, when you're talking about popular vote numbers, perfectly fine. But if I'm trying to forecast which riding they're going to get the most votes in, it's much harder with new parties than with existing ones. Not impossible, but it's much harder. That all said, there's the election going forward in Ontario really 2 years ago looked like it was going to be about Doug Ford. His approval rating was terrible, and it's still not great for the record. Del Duca had just been freshly elected the Liberal leader. He had a big bump in the polls as a result, which typically happens when a new party leader comes in. And it looked like it was going to be an election about Doug Ford. And when an election is about a particular... When the election issue is this person, that person typically loses. Not always, but typically loses. COVID, politically, has been a godsend for Doug Ford here. Not necessarily because he has done a good job or a bad job on COVID. In fact, myself and I think many others would say he's done a thoroughly mediocre job on COVID. But what he has got going for him is it's given him a lot of time and a lot of leeway on a lot of scrutiny, and a lot of the things that were initially riling up people are no longer riling up people. They've been completely surpassed by more present issues. And quite significantly here, the easing of COVID restrictions and the quote-unquote end of COVID is really politically helping Doug Ford. His biggest threat in this election has never been the NDP or the Liberals in the last 2 years. After Del Duca was first elected, it was the Liberals, but it's not anymore. His biggest threat right now, not right now, his biggest threat throughout COVID, and particularly 2021, was that the right wing of his party, who thought he was too harsh, too autocratic in his approach to COVID, was going to desert him and either form new parties like the new Blue and Ontario Party en masse, or abstain. It's looking like right now, based on the currently available polls, that he has lost a bit of his right flank, but not enough for it to be a dire threat. And on his other side, the opposition parties seem to be splintering. There's a point where maybe the New Democrats were threatening him. Sometimes it's the Liberals who are threatening him. It seems that now that Del Duca has had time in office as the Liberal leader, his new shine New Leader shine has dulled, and it's hard to say, obviously, since he's not been in government, if he's technically a bad leader or not. And he hasn't actually contested an election yet. But his name ID is not so decisive as it was, or I'm going to rephrase this. He doesn't look so clean and good compared to Doug Ford. Doug Ford has quite strong disapproval ratios, but the dirty secret in Canada, less so in countries like France or the United States, disapproval rating is completely irrelevant. Trudeau proves this every single election and every single day, for that matter. Disapproval rating in Canada literally doesn't matter. And this isn't just unique to Canada, it's any parliamentary system without a meaningful executive branch. So the United Kingdom would follow this. Lesser extent, Australia would follow this. Just to give two examples. New Zealand doesn't quite follow this because they have a slightly different electoral system than the other two, but that's not that important. The reason for this is in a multi-party Westminster system, you do not get the disapproval coalesced around one opposition party. It's split. So in the case, I believe right now Doug Ford's disapproval is 55%, and lo and behold, NDP, Liberals, Greens, 55% of the vote. His disapproval rating physically doesn't matter because all of the disapproval is split across three parties. If there was just one party, if we just called this the New Liberal Greens, which would be a dumb name, don't do that, but if it was the New Liberal Green Party and they had all that and they managed to get all of this into one huge wide tent, yeah, his disapproval rating matters. He's going to get absolutely annihilated in this election. But it's not. And it's inconceivable at this point that in Canada or other countries with similar electoral systems that it would ever coalesce behind one party. Because unlike the US, there isn't the poignancy of Senate and presidential races that really make two-party system unofficially required. In Canada, especially in the current instant where minority parliaments are fairly common, being a minority party, as long as you have enough seats to be relevant, which, for the record, the Greens never have been. But, for example, federally, you have the NDP, the Conservatives, the Bloc, the Liberals. They are all relevant seat count-wise. Up until the NDP Liberal Coalition deal, all of these parties were relevant, so voting for any of them is technically, or is not a bad idea, because it is a vote that does influence power. Whereas in the US, Senate seats and presidential seats, one winner, one seat. So it doesn't matter if you split the vote. Now, yes, any individual seat in Canada is one winner, one seat, but there's 338 of them. Ontario, there's 124. And the smaller the number of seats there are, the larger number of seats there are, the easier it is for more niche candidates to get in, allowing more parties to form. If we double the number of seats in Canada, I think we'd probably double the number of parties in Parliament that have relevant seat counts. Or not necessarily relevant seat counts, but have like a meaningful number of seats. But let's bring this all back down. Focus back to Ontario. It is extremely likely that no matter what Doug Ford does, unless his approval rating tanks, because as I just mentioned, disapproval doesn't matter, but approval does, because approval rating corresponds quite heavily with people who are willing to vote for you or open to voting for you. You have an approval rating of 0, i.e. 0% of the population likes you. Well, no one's going to vote for you. If you have an approval rating, I think in Doug Ford's case, about 40%, he can get around 40% of the vote. He's currently getting about 38, if we want to round up, 37.5 otherwise. Which is roughly on par with where his approval rating roughly is. Which shouldn't be surprising. And in fact, I think this number is going to go up if the current polling trajectory stays the way it is. The big problem, though, among the anti-Doug Ford sentiment people, is it's extremely unclear which party is better set. Now, you can look at policy issues, you can look at legislative plans, and yes, this will probably have impact going into the campaign, and it's not clear right now what all these are, so it's hard to speculate on them. But it seems like it's going to be very difficult to rally all of the Liberal and NDP voters behind one of these two parties. I don't think there's at this point, barring a major campaign mistake or a really, really strong campaign, it doesn't seem like it's going to happen. The main problems are Del Duca does not seem to be particularly charismatic. I would not say he's uncharismatic, but he doesn't really have the energy and the charisma and the force of presence to attract New Democrats to him. And the New Democrat Party has always been very difficult to expand. They did relatively well in 2018 in Ontario, and they've done relatively well in 2011 federally, which did impact Ontario as well, because the federal party did well in Ontario. But their main difficulty is being more progressive than the Liberals means a lot of the Liberal voters are not willing to take that extra dive. They're more moderate than that, which makes it very difficult for them to all rally behind the New Democrats. Now, you'll see some people argue that the strategy is you just got to look at which party, if you're like a fence sitter between the two of them, between the two parties, what you do is look at which party's leading in your current riding and then vote for that one. Which I suppose is technically correct strategic voting, though it does seem to make a mockery of the electoral system and election and democracy in general. So I would strongly recommend against things like that. Not because it's not effective, it probably would work just fine. The problem is more fundamental with things like that, is it debases the electoral system from being you're voting for the party that aligns with you the best to I don't care, I'm voting against this party. You might not like a particular party, but you really should be voting which one aligns best with you. For example, we'll go into the US because it's a cleaner example. You might not like the Republicans, you might not like the Democrats, but there's going to be one of them you agree more with, and it makes more sense to vote for that one than the one you like to vote for that reason than to vote I hate this one more. I hope that makes sense. But that's more of a digression here. We'll see going forward how that's the word for it. If there will be much momentum, or if the NDP or Liberals can rally together to one of the parties, if one of the leaders and one of the parties can dominate. But they do have, from the federals, the federal parties have kind of screwed the provincial counterparts in this regard. The creation of a national coalition and the result of the provincial parties now talking about possibly making a coalition if Doug Ford wins minority is phenomenally bad strategy. Because yes, technically speaking, they can do that, and yes, it is legitimate, or legal, I should say. Legitimate in my 2 cents on the matter. I don't really like the idea of... I don't like how the NDP and Liberals federally did a coalition. Behind back closed doors and far away from the election period, it seems kind of spitting in the face of what voters voted for. If you're talking about it before an election, I think it's more legitimate. And if you do it really soon after the election, that seems more legitimate to me. But that's neither here nor there. The important thing here, though, is the threat that they might do that, and the recent precedent that the federal versions did do that, means that one of the biggest threats to Doug Ford, which is splinter parties like the New Blue and Ontario Party, and they're not the biggest threat to him because they will beat him. They're the biggest threat to him because they could sap votes from him. Now, realistically, it seems like where they're going to be doing the best are like southern, rural Ontario areas, which it won't have any effect either way, but hypothetically it could get vote share in ridings that does cause Doug Ford, the progressive conservative candidate, to lose to an NDP or a Liberal, or even a Green, hypothetically. But by giving Doug Ford, and strictly speaking through no fault of their own, because it was the feds that did this, the poignant and clear example that, yeah, if we don't have a majority, they can form a coalition and form government. It really makes it so much harder on them. And they've sort of done this to themselves. Sort of haven't, because again, the feds did it and not the provincial parties. But the fact that the provincial parties are so even in vote share, and that a lot of their corollary votes are in areas they're both doing well in, means that it's hard for them to flip a lot of seats, because realistically they could get like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, maybe 12, 13, 14 seats. That would still give Doug Ford a majority. And I will note, those 14 seats would represent a significant portion of the 26 or 21-ish% of the vote the NDP and Liberals are currently getting, because it's heavily concentrated in these urban areas, and they're heavily vote splitting each other. In most of these urban areas like Etobicoke and York and Hamilton, Burlington, Niagara area, it it works out something like 70% are voting or it's like 63 or something on average percent are voting NDP or Liberal, but they're splitting a vote amongst each other. What that means is even if it consolidated, let's say they all consolidated by one of them, that would mean they're blowing out these ridings by 60, 70 percentage points. Or not percentage points, by 60, 70% of the vote. Which would mean their vote is incredibly concentrated in a very small number of ridings. And no matter how, and realistically, there's a reason why the NDP and Liberals both presently exist. It's because there's voters in the Liberal Party and there's voters in the NDP Party, which is redundant, but anyways, who wouldn't vote for the other one. So we're in this fascinating situation where, because the NDP is strong and the Liberals are strong, they are basically screwed. And I don't see a path forward for them without a very strong campaign from one of those leaders, or Doug Ford doing really bad campaign, or possibly these splinter parties like New Blue or Ontario Party actually taking seats, or taking enough vote that the NDP Liberals start taking seats up through the middle. And this isn't a unique Ontario thing. This is also happening in Quebec. You could argue, based on polling, it's happening in Nova Scotia now. Or, well, not even by polling, in the last Nova Scotian election. That's basically exactly what happened. It was literally this election. What's going on in the Ontario election is literally what happened in the Nova Scotia one. The Progressive Conservatives in Nova Scotia did relatively well. They got like 39%. They got the most votes. But the Liberals and the NDP together had a lot of votes. And yes, there are differences between these parties, and I don't think you should just lump vote share together. Like, if there was a super party, you would not actually get 51% of the vote. That is wrong. Don't think about it that way. But for sake of argument, you can lump those two votes together. The Progressive Conservatives in Nova Scotia only had about 39%, and the rest were other left-wing parties, like the Greens, Liberals, NDP. But what happened is, because the Liberals and the NDP were splitting vote heavily between each other, and their vote concentration was heavily in Halifax, and to a lesser extent Sydney, the Progressive Conservatives just gobbled up basically the entirety of rural Nova Scotia and a bunch of the suburbs. This is also happening in Quebec, where the CAQ is completely dominating because the opposition has like 3 parties currently polling at like 15 to 20%. So even though the CAQ is only polling around 40, they're close to winning like 100 seats out of, like 120 in Quebec. Like, completely dominating because the opposition is so heavily split. And just as a... Well, this didn't... It is quite interesting. This is the biggest flaw in a parliamentary multilateral electoral system. The more parties you add, the more disproportionate the result is. I should note that this is more of a first past the post result. Though that said, even non-first past the post elections do get similar outcomes sometimes. Depends exactly on how the electoral system is set up and exactly how the boundaries are drawn. Like, I could create an STV map of Ontario, and I could draw it in such a way that the Progressive Conservatives still blow it out, even though it's technically STV. Yeah, it would have a crap load of gerrymandering involved, but whatever. It is what it is. The electoral map, in a lot of senses, is as important as the actual voting. Big surprise. But to summarize, in this first video for Ontario, Doug Ford dominate, Doug Ford smash, and NDP and Liberals in shambles because they are completely split. And actually, just to put one last comment here, this is exactly what I think is going to happen the moment the Conservatives win federally. It will happen. It's inevitable. They will one day win. Just whenever that one day is, I don't know. No one knows. Not even if only God knows. But as soon as they win federally, what I think is going to happen is, since when the Conservatives pull out the win, it's likely going to be because the Liberals voters are exhausted of Liberals. So some of them vote Conservative for that election, some of them vote NDP. And then you're going to get a situation where the NDP and the Liberals are splitting a vote down the middle. Because, well, yes, like if you picture this as three circles. Wait, I can do this. I can draw. I have the capacity. What the heck did I just... Oh, okay, that's fine. So, picture... This is getting me dumb, but we're doing this live. So picture... We have these circles. This is awful. No, I have to redo this. How do I get an eraser? Oh God, what am I doing? We're giving up. We're just gonna go with a mental picture here. Live demo doesn't work. So there's technically overlapping on the circles for NDP voters, Liberal voters, and Progressive Conservative voters. They all overlap. There's more overlap between the Liberal NDP circles and the Liberal Conservative circles, but they all technically overlap. It's not a line. It's not a square. It's a really complicated shape. It's even my weird Venn diagram mental picture here I'm painting to you, because I cannot be spent to try to figure this out, how to do this in the moment. And I never said I'd plan these things very well. There's a lot of overlap between the NDP and the Liberals, more so than they are with the Progressive Conservatives. But it's not a perfect overlap. They will never gobble up all of the votes of the other one. There's no possible way you can create a party that has all current Liberal voters and all current NDP voters, or all current Liberal and Progressive Conservative, or all current Progressive Conservative and NDP. They don't have all the same voters. And that is the core issue. That the Liberals and NDP face. They don't have the room to maneuver here, and in a lot of regards, we can actually simplify a lot of these Canadian elections down to actually a two-party system. And right now, in 2022, in a lot of provinces and federally, the NDP and the Liberals are trying to figure out which of these two parties should be the party that opposes the Conservatives, which have maintained roughly steadfast course. I suspect going forward that everything is going to move the way that Alberta or Saskatchewan have, and essentially be a two-party system. And I will even argue most countries in Europe are actually a two-party system. I might get into this in another time. because I do have a video planned talking about electoral system, but it's down the pipeline, and I only have so many hours in a day. But just to end on this note, Doug Ford is almost certainly going to win because elections are inherently two-party. And I will discuss this more in a later time, and if I don't publish a video on this month, by all means bombard me in the comment sections until I do, because I really mean to. I just only have so many hours in the day, and sometimes I forget to do these things, but I do plan on making this video about electoral systems. But, yeah. All elections are inherently two-party system. But in the case of Ontario right now, you have one party, which is the government party, and one party, which is opposition, and the opposition party is in complete disarray. Maybe it will solidify, but it is in chaos right now. That is the simplified picture here. And we'll see going forward as the coverage covers. But otherwise, if you liked the video, please, by all means, like, share, subscribe, comment if this was too long for you, too rambly, too in the weeds. By all means, comment on if you think I made any mistakes, because maybe I did. I'm trying out a different thing here where I have I have the ridings pictured instead of regions. I might do the same thing nationally, but that would depend on me having enough time to actually find and splice together enough pre-drawn maps to make it work, and have enough resolution that I can actually color in the writings and they're actually intelligible. Let's end here to there. Comment all these things. Comment all the things. It's all wonderful. I like reading them. Otherwise, I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I will see you later this week with the final update for first round France. Otherwise, have a wonderful day.